Dear YouTube, these anime are rated PG-13. I swear to Barack Hussein Obama, if you flag my video, I'm coming for your...
Well, ladies and gentlemen, after 15 years of seething and coping, waiting and praying for a sequel, a remake, something, anything, at long last, everyone's favorite drunken wolf goddess waifu, Holo the Wise Wolf, has returned to us. And before I say anything else, I think this calls for just a little celebration.
It's time, Joe Rogan.
What?
I used to pray for times like this.
Now personally, I went into the first episode very cautiously optimistic, mostly because I couldn't help but notice all of the CG background assets in the trailer. I was horrified at the possibility that this might end up being basically the same bog-standard, middle-of-the-road level of production value and presentation we've come to expect from many modern anime, which lean on 3D less as a creative and cleverly leveraged boon, a la Heavenly Delusion, and more as a crutch, a la almost everything else. However, I can confidently say that both Holo and the show itself have returned in mostly stunning glory in the first of 25 episodes in this two-course season. Anyway, let's talk briefly about the story so far, some changes and similarities to previous iterations, discuss a bit about the audio-visual experience itself, and then try to decide whether this version should be considered more or less censorious than the last. As far as the story's presentation goes, so far, it could really be summed up as a sort of the more things change, the more they stay the same sort of approach. While it's difficult to say just how much of this approach is influenced specifically by the fact that this is a first episode attempting to reach both newcomers and nostalgic senior citizens such as myself alike, I do think we can glean a bit about their approach in general. Just take all of this with a grain of salt, as this is one episode and the direction could easily change as the season continues. The original anime opens with a narration by Holo, set to visuals of the village and its expansive fields of wheat. It's a sort of abstract historical flashback, explaining how she became entangled with the village. After meeting the first human not scared of her true form on the outskirts, she was formally introduced to the rest of the village. This also serves as a sort of lore dump of her thereafter ritualistic relationship with the village, bringing wisdom, luck, and prosperity to said village and its fields of wheat, while receiving the utmost praise, faith, and regular festive celebrations. The reboot, on the other hand, opens with an at least seemingly spoilerific flash-forward cold open. Holo recounts the tales of her journey to a small child, while both sit in a cabin surrounded by a downpour of snow. I think this accomplishes and/or represents a couple of interesting things, actually. I felt that this change was fairly self-aware, a good way of acknowledging that this is indeed a reboot, and therefore a retelling of a story which is ultimately complete at this point, at least in its original light novel format. It also arguably represents both the old reminiscent generation and the newcomers experiencing the story for the first time converging. It also, hopefully, implies that they actually plan on adapting the series to its conclusion. After this point, at least the basic key events are essentially the same, told in the same order as far as I could tell as well. Lawrence passes by a blockade, something he wouldn't typically expect to see outside of the village of Pozlo. He speaks with a knight stationed here before arriving in the village, and as it turns out, a nearby village is partaking in an allegedly pagan ritual. Times and traditions, even in their own little homely village, have changed as well, as their lord, or earl, depending on the translation, has introduced to them modern cropping techniques, which have rendered their old ways seemingly obsolete. He is introduced as a trader, well known in these parts, and after entering, learns more of the changes within the village's culture and the traditional, spiritual, or religious practices. Out with the old and antiquated gods who once brought prosperity, and in with the new gods of modern agriculture and, well, technology, so to speak. We witness a few members of the village essentially mocking Holo's power as a so-called god, but they nonetheless continue partaking in the more ritualistic and celebratory aspect of their traditions. This transformation might seem a bit strange, but it's said that people often hold on to these sort of ritualistic habits even when things like religion and faith are gone. To quote a most brief excerpt from the Tao Te Ching, "Ritual is the husk of faith and loyalty, the beginning of confusion." Anyway, Lawrence witnesses them partaking in a ritual-turned-playful game of sorts, where the one who cuts the final grouping of wheat embodies Holo, is chased by the other villagers, and is then isolated in a barn or granary for a week, in celebration of this harvest festival, in hopes of bringing prosperity, or at this point perhaps out of simple, ritualistic habit. He interacts with the villagers a bit more before sitting down to talk with the village chief, discussing the changes, the growth of the village's economy, and recounting old times and Lawrence's previous apprentice. After leaving the village for the first time, he finally meets Holo the wise and most certainly beautiful wolf, who was stowed away in the back of his carriage thanks to the bundle of wheat he brought into the village. He initially believes her to be one of the demon-possessed, but eventually agrees to take her with him if she proves that she is indeed Holo the Wise as she claims. He claims that she ought to, of course, bring him wisdom and prosperity, and therefore increase his status and renown as a trader. He is, however, shocked and afraid by her transformation, and Holo walks away after returning to her human form. Lawrence heads back to the village and is reunited with an old friend, rival, and once his very own trade apprentice. In this case, Yarei, and not Chloe from Season 1. After reminiscing and living it up into the evening with his old friend and apprentice, he finds Holo once again stashed away in his inn room. He eventually agrees to partner with her, and the next morning they embark on a long journey to her homeland in the north. And that's basically where the episodes both end. So I mentioned both Yarei and Chloe. Now I haven't read the rest of the light novels personally. I want to be totally transparent about that. But Chloe was indeed anime only, with Yarei serving as the novel's canonical counterpart to her. Fun fact, it was actually Chloe who tackled Yarei in the new version, and you can see her smirking down at him right here. I thought that was a really cool touch, acknowledging the version that many of us grew up with and loved. Although I've seen many claims that the new version is indeed more faithful with details like this one, apparently there are still some anime original scenes present, taken from the original anime series. For example, although Yarei's role hasn't been replaced by Chloe, the potential love interest and partner prospect in that case, Lawrence still returns to the village after getting scared by Holo's transformation, which apparently is not in the novels. There are also many seemingly important elements still briskly glossed over or outright missing. The scene of Lawrence touching Holo's transformed arm just before his moment of panic. More of Lawrence's inner dialogue explaining his personal motivations and the loneliness that he shares with Holo. How the refreshing shared banter also helped motivate him to take her in as his companion, implying that maybe his wishes aren't so selfish or greedy after all. There was also originally more emphasis on an explanation of the concept of the demon-possessed, going into their treatment from literal childbirth by parents, the church, and the village. Many of them might be locked up alone in the woods to avoid the fate that they might face with the church: death. This also provides the explanation as to why Lawrence immediately assumed Holo might be one of the demon-possessed herself when he saw her in the specific condition she was in, once again, most likely having been locked away in the woods from an early age by her parents, etc. Hopefully that abridged explanation doesn't simply offer further confusion. I'm mostly going off of what Otaku Spirit said in his video, but unlike me, he has actually read the novels, and I found him to be one of the more trustworthy of anime vloggers when it comes to providing accurate info on things like this. Once again, take that all as you will. As far as the audio goes, there's really not much to complain about whatsoever. I haven't heard the dub yet, but the seiyuu for basically all of the important characters, including Holo and Lawrence, have returned to reprise their roles, and have done a fantastic job so far. The music is also quite pleasant, and reminiscent of the original as well, mostly made up of orchestral fantasy music. The highlights for me were definitely the more isolated traditional drum beats, and the absolutely angelic music that played when Lawrence first discovered Holo. As is the case with many elements of the presentation, it's very atmospheric. I'm going to be using that word a lot, by the way, because it was a very atmospheric episode. Anyway, it's safe to say that I cannot wait till the OST drops. There were some pretty decent Foley sound effects and the like right out of the gate as well. Wind, running water, chirping birds, crackling fireplaces, creaking wood, the sounds of sickles slicing wheat, etc. This really helped to sell all that atmosphere alongside the music and the frequently moody lighting provided by a lot of nice compositing work. I couldn't help but notice, however, while rewatching the original pilot episode, that the Foley or nature sound effects were a bit more pronounced and sort of ever-present in 2008. I also wouldn't say that the new Foley sound effects themselves are anything on the level of something like Frieren or Heavenly Delusion, but to complain about that would be like looking down on Holo just because she isn't a literal deity. You know what I mean? It's really good. I've just been quite a bit spoiled on this front lately, and of course, you may have been as well. There's also lots of dynamism in the audio levels in general. The following is not something I personally take issue with in modern anime, but I definitely didn't feel like this was one of those shows where all of the voices were compressed to the same level no matter how far from the camera they were or how loud they were speaking. And I do think that also contributed to the sense of atmosphere a bit. As far as the visuals go, there are quite a few examples of the classic 3D horse, wagon, and background characters, but they're not ever present, and I can't say that they looked especially bad most of the time either. It's all far less distracting than the trailers led me to fear, at least so far. As I said, I'm pretty sure none of these assets were 3D the entire time either, and the 3D assets themselves were somewhat understandable given the size of some of these crowds, and how many of the characters carefully placed closest in shot clearly were 2D. Most of the 3D background characters seem to serve as a sort of filler, placed way off behind the closer, more detailed background characters. Looking back at the original for a quick comparison, as much as I adore classic anime visuals and the minimalistic, one might even say humble, painterly aesthetic, it's impossible to ignore that in this case, it does look dated at times. Humble and charming, sure, but also perhaps even a tad bit stilted during scrolling shots and some of the unmoving face shots. This is not at all a problem for me personally, but I can see why some indeed consider the original show dated. With that said, there are actually quite a few dynamic tracking shots in the original episode, and some gorgeous parallax camera effects as well. I am not saying that it looks old and objectively bad or anything. Do not get it twisted, I am not one of those people. Anyway, apparently Holo's design in the new series is actually more faithful to the light novels, and frankly, she looks absolutely gorgeous, so I am not about to complain about any changes in her design itself. I also couldn't help but notice that Lawrence looks a decent bit older in this version, which is always a bit refreshing to be honest, and I can only guess is more accurate since I know that the village chief's perceived age was also altered in the original anime. What I was probably most pleased with visually, at least before I saw Holo of course, was the use of multiple art styles. The wheat fields in the introductory scene are of a gorgeous and very surreal aesthetic. The OP is made up of beautiful watercolor-like visuals, while the ED is full of stop-motion-like papery aesthetic animations and adorable little chibi versions of our favorite characters. The show itself was of course not astoundingly dynamic so far, but quite beautiful with a lot of fairly subtle but lush color and compositing, which as mentioned earlier lent many of the scenes a very atmospheric sense of lighting. What I must admit I didn't care for at all in this regard was Yarei's flashback filter, with the blur, color glows around the lines, patchy effects, and the like. It just looked like they slapped some sort of weird video game filter over the top to represent the flashback footage, where I think that a simple aspect ratio shift or grain overlay would have served much better. Otherwise, there's not much to complain about other than the fact that CG background characters do indeed exist, and frankly, they're better utilized than most I've seen anyways. As for what was clearly the visual highlight of the episode, Holo's entrance sequence was absolutely beautiful. Especially this majestic hair fling and all the glorious, side boob. But more on that later, I somehow said with a straight face. To wrap this section up, there were definitely a few fairly iconic cuts from the original 2008 anime which appeared to be directly referenced, and might I say beautifully, in the new episode. This includes a few cuts from our favorite pair's more formal introductions while riding the wagon out of the village, this opening shot from the ED sequence, as well as some of the nicest shots and some of the nicest shots from Holo's introduction. And on that note, of course, if we're going to talk about the visuals for this show in particular, including our beloved wolf goddess, who deserves all the praise we can give her, we have to talk at length, more specifically, about the quote-unquote
Subscribe if you like oppai.
This video is so getting demonetized when I get monetized, but I refuse to censor what's essentially already been censored unless I absolutely have to. I mean, that would frankly just be absurd, right? Plus, I kinda wouldn't be able to illustrate anything I'm talking about anyway. Anyway, I mentioned a moment ago that there were a few referenced cuts, including some in Holo's introductory scene. There were, however, a few moments where I felt the absence of fairly memorable moments. For example, the adorable little tail wiggle from the original anime's scene, where Holo reached down to pick up the jerky. Perhaps they wanted to lean away from this simply because it didn't seem like what Lawrence would be focused on, too busy trying to make sure he doesn't get killed by a demon and all that. But it is a tad bit difficult not to imagine that they also simply felt like that angle might be too much for quote-unquote modern audiences. There is, after all, quite an obvious and total lack of any lower nudity shots across the board. Lots of side boob nonetheless, don't get me wrong, but it seems that they have mostly avoided having to show anything from the waist down whatsoever, except for mostly distant, cleverly framed shots where the most offensive lines could easily be covered or obscured by her hair, her tail, the walls of the wagon, etc.
4 to 6 weeks later.
Editor's note. Yeah, about that. If I had just waited one more week, I would have realized that they're not too shy to show a little backside every now and again, if you know what I am saying.
You know what I'm saying?
This is embarrassing to admit, but I legit legit had to rewind during this scene because I was not reading the subtitles at all. First time I've understood people who say fan service is distracting in quite a while. Anyway, color me pleasantly surprised. Also, as long as I'm recording again, it's a few weeks later, so I'll just quickly say that I am still enjoying the show. There are definitely some flaws here and there, and I certainly find myself missing the 2008 anime's painterly aesthetic from time to time, but I'm enjoying many of the changes, and I'm enjoying the visual production way more than I expected to. As someone who seldom watches dubs anymore, I've also really enjoyed hearing so many of the original dub cast return, and I just realized that there's actually an English version of the opening song as well, and it's actually really good. Anyway, I just wanted to clarify my statements and take a moment to say that I am indeed still enjoying the show. And back to the original script. And hey, maybe it sounds weird to bring this up at all, but just hear me out. Let me cook for a few minutes. This is important. While the show has certainly always had an only somewhat subdued sense of sex appeal, it's definitely not a fan service show. And Holo has some of the most tasteful and frankly natural nudity probably in all of anime. She is, first and foremost, a fox spirit after all. I have nonetheless seen a decent few people complaining about the visual changes, calling this version more censorious. Now, I myself would usually be exactly the kind of coomer to complain that Holo isn't full naked anymore. I do hate true censorship anywhere it rears its ugly head, especially when the censorship is applied to gore or nudity that has implicit meaning, Zom 100's nudity for example. And yes, you're just gonna have to subscribe to find out what I mean by that. But the truth is, I dislike censorship across the board. I dislike it on pure principle. I dislike it because it always ends up going too far, no matter how long it might take. I dislike it when stuff I like gets censored, and I dislike it when stuff that absolutely disgusts me gets censored. I honestly believe that true censorship is basically just straight up evil, greed-fueled corporate marketing nonsense enforced from the top down, essentially 100% of the time.
This is their plan, people. These are demons.
Censorship of source materials does not happen because of some respectable artistic vision, but because they think they'll reach a broader audience and therefore make more money, or that it'll be better for their squeaky clean image. 10 times out of 10.
It's a plan! And I'm angry! I'm not a slave! I've broken the conditioning! It doesn't work on me!
That's what I believe. I think marketing forces determine far more than we'd like to think, often at the expense of artistic integrity, and you're free to think of that whatever you want. However, I honestly cannot bring myself to complain about what we got here.
When I look at a woman that beautiful, it's hard.
I think you'd be hard-pressed to make a solid argument for genuinely malicious censorship with all the, side boob and cleavage present all throughout the introductory scene. Also, I'm pretty sure that there's no explicit nudity in the novels to begin with, so it really comes down to the question of, if you're going to do so anyway, what is the best way to adapt and or censor a character who's kinda just naked all the damn time, in a show that might have themes of nudity, but doesn't run on a sort of explicit sense of sex appeal. Once again, you might be questioning why I would even discuss this at length, but it only makes sense to discuss this change, keeping in mind that we're almost certainly going to be seeing way more birthday suit Holo throughout the rest of the series. And anyway, screw you, I want to talk about it. Imaginary adversary who probably never would have made it this far into the video anyway. Yeah, you.
You are an ass.
I think it's interesting and I want to talk about it. Frankly, I think more people should talk about this sort of thing openly. Whether it's the various forms of censorship, the meaning and the presence or absence of nudity, etc. I want to talk about the following example in particular because it's an interesting question that fellow cultured anime enthusiasts have had their differences on for decades. And that is, once again, the question of how to keyword most tastefully censor a character who's just kinda naked all the time. Magic hair and conveniently placed objects covering the goods, or 100% smooth skin eliminating the problematic pixels entirely. I'm also obviously curious as to which you prefer. Should this be a full video where I go in depth and speak more carefully on the topic? Probably, but I've got like 10 videos in the editing bay as we speak, so—
No! God, please, no! 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 No!
And with that 10-minute long disclaimer out of the way, in the original anime, they show full frontal and often backside nudity as well, with the classic no sexual organs, 100% smooth skin approach. And of course, by whatever logic we strange creatures operate on, that makes it basically no different than if they were just wearing tight clothes, and therefore allows it to slip below the threshold that would otherwise put the show in a higher age rating, as there is, and I quote, no graphic nudity whatsoever. In the new version, they go with the equally classic, her hair, tail, and conveniently placed objects magically cover her naughty pixels no matter what technique. First off, I understand that some will complain that in this new version, with that approach, the hair will sometimes unnaturally stick to the chest in a distracting way, and it definitely did just that, if only for a moment, when she went to pick up the jerky. I mean, what, has she got a magnet in there or something? However, at least personally speaking, I think it's usually way more distracting to see a beautiful, otherwise bare feminine figure without nipples. At least with the hair covering the offensive pixels, I can still fill in the gaps with my imagination, as opposed to staring down what is sort of an uncanny image of an otherwise beautifully rendered woman. With that said, I do think that the uncanny effect can actually be mitigated or even sort of taken advantage of in a sense, depending on what sort of series it is and what sort of beings are being censored. Supernatural entities kind of fit the bill for that, in my opinion, more uncanny approach. And I'd argue that this is one reason it's been implemented in shows like Ava, Hell's Paradise more recently, and of course, the original Spice and Wolf. What I think we can probably all agree on is that either one is better than black bars, light leaks, and even random mist or fog. I would rank them in this order personally. What about you? Hello? Is anyone there? Anyway, I don't really have enough time left to try and dig into any deeper themes of nudity or sexuality or whatever, but at the very least it's important to once again keep in mind that Holo is, for all intents and purposes, an animal spirit. It is therefore quite natural that she is comfortable in this level of attire, and I think that her confident character acting portrays this quite well. All in all, I actually think they did a wonderful job of portraying her naturally and walking the line between tasteful and sexy. I've also seen some people complaining about the lack of shading here, but personally I was also really surprised at what a sense of weight and volume was implied with such a minimalistic line art approach to many of these cuts. At the end of the day, disregarding small tidbits of distracting 3D models and the frankly depressing absence of Holo butt, I find it difficult to complain about what we got in the first episode, and I'm quite excited for more. I really hope the new series does not skip multiple novels like the OG Season 2, but I don't think that there's any reason to believe it will, especially seeing as this is a 2-episode or 2-course season. I'm looking forward to laughing at and falling in love with drunk Holo all over again, and most certainly looking forward to getting to know Lawrence better as well as finding out just how interesting and practical the trade advice really is now that I'm a bit older. More than anything, I'm once again hoping and praying that we'll have the privilege of seeing this wonderful romance story play itself out to its conclusion. Anyway, if you've already checked out the first episode, how are you feeling about the reboot? Do you like the approach they took to the story so far? The music and the atmosphere? The new art style and character designs? Any preference on the new modus operandi of quote-unquote censorship? Most importantly, I just hope that you enjoyed this. Peace.